Hi everybody, welcome back to Geology 109. This is the introduction video for Lab Exercise 4, where we're going to be covering principles of stratigraphy and geologic time. So I'm going to be walking you through some of the key concepts. Some of these we've also covered in lecture, but I want to just kind of cover them once again briefly as we get ready to do this lab exercise. And at the end, I'll explain a little bit more about some tips on actually working with these PDF exercises that you can then submit to Canvas. So let's jump right in. So hopefully you'll remember from our previous exercise on sedimentary rocks that sediments, which are loose unconsolidated material that accumulates at the Earth's surface, can go into a variety of these different kinds of basins. So we call these sedimentary or depositional environments, and these are places where sediments are deposited, and they can be deposited by wind, water, ice, essentially gravity. Now, every depositional or sedimentary environment has a very specific set of physical, chemical, and biological conditions that represent that environment. So if you were to go to a beach today, you would see sand-sized sedimentary particles. You'd probably find a lot of shell fragments. There's probably going to be a minimal amount of plant material getting incorporated into that, but you are going to see a lot of marine fossils. The sediment might be stacked up into dunes or ripples where the waves are crashing into the beach. So those are physical characteristics, those are biological characteristics, and chemical would be what is the sand made of? Is it quartz sand? Is it a calcitic sand? Those physical, chemical, and biological attributes represent that beach environment. Now, if the depositional medium, like how hard the waves are crashing or if there's a storm event, changes, then we're going to also see changes in those characteristics that are then deposited. So we break down our sedimentary environments into three main categories: our continental environments, transitional environments, and marine sedimentary environments. Now, these aren't going to be exhaustive lists by any means, but just to point out some of the more common types of environments we have in each of these three realms, for lack of a better phrase. Let's start with continental. With continental environments, we can have things like alluvial fans. This is coming down from mountain ranges as sediments are cascading down. You get these kind of wide cascading aprons of sediment around the base of mountain ranges. We call that an alluvial fan. And the type of sediments, the physical, chemical, and biological attributes we have of those are unique to alluvial fans. Your river systems, which we call fluvial systems, includes rivers and streams, whether it's a braided river or a meandering river or an anastomosing river. All of these are going to have very specific types of physical, chemical, and biological attributes. These are usually medium-sized clastic sediments with some overbank muds and things like that. Aeolian deposits refer to deserts and dunes. This is going to be any kind of clastic sediment that's windblown. So what you might see in a desert. Lacustrine environments include lakes and very large ponds. These are characterized by usually very fine-grained sediments that deposit in very, very thin layers. Our glacial environments are also unique to where there's glacial deposits. So this would be work that's been done by glaciers as it moves through or retreats back from an ecosystem and from an environment. And finally, our paludal, which means swamps and marshes. These are going to have a lot of organics composed in there and minimal amounts of clastic sediments. As we move down slope towards the ocean, we end up in our transitional environments. This is where we go from terrestrial into marine. And deltas are a really common location to see sediments deposited in these transitional environments, because you're seeing a stream, which is by definition a channelized flow of water, suddenly widening out into a larger basin of water. As such, the energy that's transporting that sediment changes very abruptly. And so we have very unique types of deposits associated with deltas. We already mentioned beaches, but barrier islands too. These are any types of sand that are deposited along shore or sometimes immediately offshore. Your tidal flats are areas that are broad, flat areas that alternate between wet and dry conditions. So when the tide goes in and the tide comes out, these are areas that are going through these wet-dry cycles, sometimes daily, sometimes more than once a day. And then lagoons. These are going to be very shallow water bodies that are separated by barrier islands. So you've got this relationship between the shoreline, the beach, and the lagoons. These are all of our transitional environments. And then finally, we get to our marine, our deep water, or approaching deep water environments. And we actually divide up our marine environments based on how deep they really are. We have our shallow marine environments like the continental shelf. This is pretty much if you go to the beach and you start walking into the sea, from the moment your feet are underwater, going all the way out, sometimes many, many miles before you see a gradual drop off. That's the continental shelf. And this exists from the shoreline to that continental slope. Around the margin of those slopes is where we usually have our coral reefs. These are going to be wave-resistant structures with lots of biogenic sediment there. So skeletal material from organisms, corals that have been busted around. Going downslope from that, we get the continental slope, and then what we refer to as the continental rise, where things start to flatten out a little bit. Our deep, deep marine environments. There's not a lot of coarse-grained sediments here. It's mostly fine-grained clays and maybe some silts. And then our abyssal plains are the deepest portions of our oceans. Not the deepest, those would be trenches, but these are the deepest, flattest areas in our deep marine settings. All of these environments, whether we're talking about continental, transitional, or marine, are all going to have very unique packages of sediments that represent those environments based on their physical, chemical, and biological attributes. Now, I keep repeating that phrase, physical, chemical, and biological attributes, because that's really getting at the core of what we're talking about in lab this week. Every kind of environment where sediments are accumulating, where there's organisms living, and where there's some kind of weather and climate happening, any kind of place like that is going to have the potential to be preserved into the geologic record. So let's go back to our beach deposit example. If you go to a beach and you're describing the sand chemistry, the size of the grains, the rounding of the grains, how they're stacked up, sedimentary structures, fossils you find there, what kind of wind and water energy are associated with that, all of those characterize that beach. And when we have an environment that is characterized by physical, chemical, and biological attributes of sediment, we have a word for that, and that is known as a sedimentary facies. The sedimentary facies is a really, really important concept. A facies is the term we use to describe the sediments deposited in an environment under specific conditions and incorporating their physical, chemical, and biological traits. So, for example, if you have sediment that's being deposited, sand, for example, that's being deposited by wind or water into ripples or dunes, you might end up with a cross-bedded sandstone facies. All of those characteristics are represented and preserved in the rock. Or if you have organisms that are wiggling their way through mud and digging holes, a process we call bioturbation, that can become lithified into a sedimentary rock, and we would describe it as a bioturbated shale facies. In the diagram at the bottom of this slide, though, you'll notice that we have a stable sea level and we have a generalized continental slope where we have a shoreline that goes into deeper water. In the shallowest to even subaerially exposed areas, we have a conglomerate facies. Our most coarse-grained material is usually associated with shallow water. And then notice we go from conglomerate to a sand facies, a silt facies, a shale facies, and a carbonate facies. What's happening here is our grain size is getting smaller as we go into deeper water. Okay? Now, another thing I want you to note is that our facies grade over distance from left to right. There's no abrupt change. It's not like we put up a wall and say no more shale, now it's carbonate. These grade into each other, just as modern day environments today grade into each other. They flow from one to the next. Now I want you to think what would happen if these are all the facies that are being deposited, let's say right now. If you were to go to this pebbly beach, you'd be standing on gravel looking out over the water, and in the shallow water, sand is being deposited. And as the water gets deeper, you're seeing silt and shale and carbonates, respectively. Now, what would happen if we change sea level? If we rose sea level, our conglomerate facies would start depositing behind us. And where we are standing right now, if the sea level went up, maybe sand would be depositing there. Alternatively, if we lowered sea level, this belt of all these different facies would move seaward. Facies are very commonly indicative of these types of conditions, such as water depth, how saline the water is, how much energy that water had, and we can use these to interpret ancient depositional environments. So by looking at sedimentary rocks and understanding what a facies is and how facies change over time, we can study the change of an environment over time. So let's take a quick look back at some of those continental sedimentary environments we talked about a few moments ago, the alluvial fans, the dunes, the lacustrine, and so on. Well, how would we identify an ancient alluvial fan? We would want to look for an alluvial fan facies, which is characterized as being poorly sorted conglomerates to arkose that are commonly cross-bedded. Dune facies would be characterized by very well sorted and well-rounded sandstone grains. They would be cross-bedded. They'd also be frosted, kind of like a frosty beer mug, because these grains are blowing around, and we'd rarely find any vertebrate bones or tracks. A lacustrine facies would be characterized by a siltstone, laminated shales, meaning very thinly bedded shales or maybe thinly bedded limestones. They would show mud cracks, and we'd probably have a lot of freshwater fossils associated with those. Glacial environments would be unsorted. They'd have very little stratification, but the conglomerates and shales would be kind of mixed up. There'd be boulders and very few fossils. Our streams and fluvial systems would be moderate to well-sorted, well-rounded, conglomerates all the way down to shales. There'd be cross-bedding, asymmetrical ripple marks, what we call tool marks. This is from things being dragged by currents through a river, and possibly grading sediments going from coarse to fine to coarse again. Our swamp or paludal environments, those facies would have well-sorted siltstones, lots of shale, but mostly peat and coal, plant and fish fossils. And finally, our Playa Lakes. These are lakes in the desert that dry up during the dry seasons and only have water in them for a few months out of the year. We would see what we call a Playa Lake facies, would be very thinly bedded gypsums and hydrites and salts and lots of mud cracks. Similarly, if we look at our transitional sedimentary environments, the facies we have here, again, what you would kind of expect. Your deltas would be poorly sorted to moderately sorted sandstones, siltstones, and shales, cross-bedding. There'd be burrow and plant material and some marine fossils. It's a little bit of land meets sea type facies. Our beach and barrier island facies would be well-sorted sandstones that are rippled and cross-bedded with a coquina, which is a type of limestone that's made entirely of broken shell fragments. Our lagoon facies, siltstones and shales that are thinly bedded, very, very fine, little ripples, and some burrows and trails from marine organisms. Our tidal flat facies, siltstones and shales, asymmetrical ripples, and very fine-grained carbonates, so micrites or lithographic limestones. And our marine sedimentary environments have very distinct facies as well. There's a clastic shelf facies, which is sandstones with planar bedding and a lot of burrows. Your carbonate shelf facies, which has a lot of oolitic limestones and fossiliferous limestones. Your reef facies are lots of fossiliferous limestones that may be brecciated or broken. The continental slope and rise have facies that include laminated shales that may have some bioturbation from organisms. And the abyssal plains have some of the very, very thinnest bedded shales on the planet and a lot of microfossils as well, small organisms floating through the ocean that when they die, they sink down to these areas. So all of these environments we talked about have very distinct types of facies that represent them in the geologic record. But remember, when I showed that facies diagram, I mentioned that sea level was stable. But what if sea level changes? What if the water level goes up or it goes down? Well, we have a phrase for those. We call those transgressions and regressions. A transgression is a change in relative sea level where the shoreline is moving landward. So I want you to imagine yourself on the beach. and you're standing right at the shoreline where the water is just coming up and crashing against your toes. Now, imagine you transport in time into the future, but you're still standing in the same place. But at this point, the shoreline is behind you. It has moved landward, where now you're maybe up to your knees in water. We would call that a transgression. So anytime a continent subsides or you have continental flooding, that's a type of transgression. These produce very distinct types of sequences. Over time, transgressions, if they continue, will produce fining upward sequences, where if you look at a stack of rocks that have been deposited over a transgression, they start out with coarse grains at the bottom and fine grains towards the top. Now, alternatively, you go back to that same location, and over time you experience a regression. In this case, the sea is moving out away from the land. The shoreline is moving in the seaward direction. This could be from uplifting a continent tectonically, or it could be from drainage from a flood, like falling sea levels. This is going to produce the opposite type of sequence than a transgression. Regressions are indicative by a coarsening upward sequence, where you start out with fine-grained material, and it could be just relatively fine-grained, and it gets progressively more coarse as you go up sequence. So here you can see in the top diagram, that's a regression. Notice we have a belt of facies on the bottom that go laterally from sand to shale to limestone. And then notice where the sand extends to in the next layer and in the third layer. They all move in the seaward direction. Now, if you do a slice through that, you'll notice limestone capped by shale, capped by sandstone. That's getting progressively more coarse, and that's a regression or a relative fall in sea level. Alternatively, with your transgressions, you can get coarse grained material at the bottom, and it gets progressively finer at the top because the shoreline from the bottom to top is moving landward. But I want you to note something, that the pattern we have horizontally, sand, shale, limestone, is also represented vertically, sand, shale, limestone. And this is what we call Walter's Law. It's that a vertical sequence of strata represents environments that were also adjacently, in the past, they were laterally adjacent. So in other words, when you look at a single slice in time, which I've highlighted here in red, in both our transgression and our regression, those are a series of facies happening during a moment or a snapshot in time. Those are the different environments being deposited from one space to another. Right now, as you sit here watching this lecture, there is sand being deposited in a beach, there is shale being deposited in a lake, and there's carbonates being formed out in the ocean. Right now. Now, over time, as sea level fluctuates with transgressions and regressions, our facies shift laterally on top of the previous facies. So from T1, meaning time 1, to time 2, to time 3, our belt of facies has shifted laterally. And when you look at time 1, 2, and 3 as a sequence, you can interpret what facies were next to each other at a moment in time in the past. So this allows geologists to look at a stack of rocks and understand, oh, at this location, here's how these rocks were deposited. But it also lets us know that these are the same types of sediments that used to be adjacent to each other in the past. Now, sometimes we have numerous stacks, or what we call stratigraphic columns, of different types of sedimentary rock. And they've been eroded out in the middle. Like, imagine if you were standing in the middle at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you look at the rocks to your left and the rocks to your right, you notice that they're the same, but where you're standing is where they've been eroded away. They've been stripped away by a river. Well, what we do in that case is we draw lines of correlation, where we draw lines in between the contacts, not the center of the rocks, but the upper and lower boundaries of those rocks, across that space to understand the equivalence. So when we do this with just rocks, we call it lithostratigraphic correlation, because we're just correlating rocks. And so as you can notice in the figure on the left, we have a coarse conglomerate at the bottom. On top of that is a coarse sandstone and then a shale. And so we can draw in the contacts, the upper and lower contact of that sandstone. That says the Conglomerates and sands and shales in column A correspond to the ones in column B. Notice, though, that the next rock in column A is a siltstone, and we don't have that over in B. But we do have the next two rocks, that coarse sand and the conglomerate once again. Well, what we do in this case is we have that siltstone just gradually pinch out. We say it gets thinner and thinner, and it just doesn't appear over in column B. Perhaps it was never deposited there. We don't know what kind of space is in between these two. But now that we've correlated them together, we've made it one wall of rock. And we can now interpret things that we couldn't do before. For example, we notice that the entire bottom is a coarse conglomerate, and then it fines a little bit to a finer sand, and then we get into a shale. That represents a transgression because our grains are getting from coarse to fine. But then on top of that shale, we have a siltstone, which then grades into a sand and back into a conglomerate again. That's a coarsening upward sequence, and we call that a regression. Now, that's all lithostratigraphic correlation. That's saying that the rocks deposited in column A are similar to the ones deposited in column B, but it does not necessarily suggest they were deposited at the same time. To understand when they were deposited, we have to use biostratigraphic correlation, and that's looking for fossils, the same kind of fossils in both columns. Because organisms in the fossil record usually only were around for a few million years at a time. Every species, not all species live forever. So if you find the same fossil in two different types of rock, that tells you those rocks were formed within at least the range of time that that organism existed before it went extinct. So in the image on our right, we have the same strata that we had in the first lithostratigraphic correlation, but in this case, we're just correlating the fossils. We have the same fossil in A and B. Even though they're in different rocks, we can draw a dotted line suggesting these two rocks were formed at about the same time, even though they're entirely different facies. Now, the second part of this week's lab deals with geological time, specifically relative age dating. And I just want to briefly review some of the Steno principles. Specifically, the law of superposition, that in an undisturbed sequence, the oldest rocks are on the bottom. The law of original horizontality, that even if rocks are uplifted and folded, that happened after they were deposited. You can't fold rocks that don't exist yet. The law of lateral continuity is kind of what we were just talking about with correlation, that even if you have a break in rocks, that break had to happen later because sediments are deposited in more or less uniform continuous layers. And cross-cutting relationships. In this case, we have units 1, 2, and 3. 4 cuts through them, and then 5 is deposited in the youngest area. And we know that because even number 4 is cut by number 5. So just please review these stratigraphic principles of Steno's to help you out with the lab this week. I also want to remind you about unconformities. Remember, not every part of the geologic record is represented by rocks. Sometimes it's the absence of them. And we have our 3 kinds of unconformities. In figure A, we have a disconformity, where we have sedimentary deposits, then we shut off the sediment supply for a while, and then we turned it back on. Or there was erosion in between. So where our black squiggly line is in figure A, below that we have a sandstone, above that we have a shale. Those could be separated by millions of years. Okay. We have a major unconformity here in this part of Wisconsin, where we have early Paleozoic carbonates capped by Pleistocene glacial deposits. And there's hundreds of millions of years separating those two out. In figure B, we have a nonconformity, where we have igneous or metamorphic material that's been exposed, partially eroded, and then with sedimentary beds on top of it. Again, the unconformity is the contact. It's that black squiggly line. And it's telling us that there's a significant amount of time missing from this portion of the geologic record. It's like a chapter or a couple chapters that have been torn out of the center of a book. And finally, figure C is an angular unconformity where we had horizontally deposited beds. They were uplifted and tilted, partially eroded, and with horizontally deposited sediment on top. Again, the unconformity there is that squiggly line telling you that there was a significant amount of time in between the last rock deposited before tilting, all of the time during tilting, and erosion before we started depositing that limestone on top of it. And finally, wanted to briefly review a little bit more on faults and inclusions. Okay. Inclusions would be if you have any kind of pre-existing rock that is weathered and you're left with pebbles of it, and then it gets buried under new sediment. Those pebbles are what we would call then inclusions. Inclusions are always older than the rocks surrounding them. They have to exist first before they can be included. Okay. Faults also cut through pre-existing rocks, so faults are always younger than the rocks they're cutting through. Okay. And I want to talk a little bit more about faults. We have two main kinds of vertical faults that we're going to be talking about. You've got a hanging wall and a footwall. The footwall is always the rock that's kind of at the base. The hanging wall is the one that's moving, sliding uphill or downhill from that. So we can actually, if you want to use the terms hanging wall and footwall, that's totally fine. But I like to we're going to call this block A and this block B. Same thing here, A and B. Now I want you to imagine block B, which is the footwall, is a ramp. And block A is an object on that ramp. In our first example, notice that block A is sliding down the ramp. That's a normal fault. And in figure B, block A is sliding up the ramp. That is a reverse fault. Normal faults are formed from stretching and extending the crust. Reverse faults are formed by compressing and squeezing the crust. Now think about it. If you had a ramp and you were trying to get an object down it, under normal conditions, you could set it down and it could slide down like a normal fault. But if you wanted to push something up a ramp, you have to get behind it and shove, and that would be a reverse fault. So a normal fault has forces that move like this, and a reverse fault have compressional forces. So a normal fault is extensional, a reverse fault is compressive. And finally, I want to start getting everybody used to reading the geologic time scale, because after the first exam, we're going to start working our way through this. Most of Earth's history is tied up there at the very bottom in what we call the Precambrian, the Hadean, Archean, and Proterozoic. And this really represents the history of the Earth from 4.6 billion years ago to about 550 million years ago. It's a vast, significant portion of Earth's history. After the Precambrian, we get into the Phanerozoic Eon, which is broken up into three eras: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. Each of these eras is broken up further into a number of geologic periods and sometimes subdivided further into what we call epochs. Now, we had all of these names in order based on stratigraphy, Steno's principles, superposition, biostratigraphy, all of those tools. It wasn't until centuries later that we were actually able to determine the absolute ages, how many millions of years before present, that these periods spanned and these eras and eons spanned. So as we move through the rest of the semester, both in lab and in lecture, we're going to be working our way through the geologic time scale. We're going to go back and start at the beginning, so that's a good place to start, and we're going to go all the way up to our more modern or recent Quaternary period. So for exercise 4, what we're going to be doing is you're going to download the PDF of exercise 4, which is found in Canvas under the Labs module. Now, you can print this off and do it by hand if you'd like, but I want to show you a little bit on how you can do this on your computer. Okay, it's important that when it's completed that you save it as a PDF and then upload it to the designated location on Canvas. So what I figured I'd do real quick is kind of walk you through a way of dealing with these PDFs that we're using for lab for the next couple of weeks. So in this case, what you want to do is download the actual PDF from Canvas onto your computer's desktop. You want to be able to use this offline. It'll automatically try to launch it in the browser. You want to say no, download it to your actual computer and open it up in Adobe Reader. Notice that at the top of your screen for Adobe Reader, you should have some tools. We're going to be using the highlighter. I don't care what color you use, but we're going to be using the highlighter. Obviously, you want to enter in your name. And then for the first part of this exercise, this is a correlation exercise. Correlate the stratigraphic columns in figure A by drawing lines of correlation matching the rock type. So in this case, what I'm going to do is select my highlighter, and I have a conglomerate here at the bottom, topped by a sandstone. And so I see that in both columns, and so I'm going to use my mouse and highlighter and draw in my correlations. Remember, this question specifically is asking you to do this for rock type, so make sure you're paying attention to the directions very carefully before you start doing this. Make sure you're doing what it's asking you to do. Okay, so that's all I would have to do for this part, and then I would save this PDF, maybe with your last name, exercise 4-109, whatever. And when you're done with the entire thing, it goes on, there's other pages of this, you want to save it and then upload that to the appropriate spot on Canvas. If you absolutely can't do this and you want to print this off, do it by hand, take pictures, compile that into a single PDF file, and then upload it. That's fine too. It's a little more labor intensive, but I'll leave that up to you. But it is possible to do all of this on the actual computer without printing it off. I'll leave that up to you. Just know that this is a little bit easier. The other step, though, does work just as fine. So hopefully that helps clear things up a little bit and get you on the right track. Of course, if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. I'm hoping that you can get this done and it's due within 1 week of your regularly scheduled lab time. And otherwise, I will see you all next week in lab when we start looking at geologic maps. Thanks.